2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35 are about Josiah. And you remember how old Josiah was when he became king? Yeah, he was 8. So they're obviously, you don't put an 8-year-old in charge of a kingdom and just let him do whatever he wants. There are going to be people who are helping him, advisors. But officially, he got to make decisions. And when he was 16, when he was 8, he began to start to clean up the land. He's starting to work in the high places, to tear them down. He's starting to take out different temples and different things that were going on. He's outlawing all of these things. But around age 16, he went into, he told them to clean the temple up. Remember, this has already been tried before. Hezekiah, I believe it was, one of the kings had set the men in charge of cleaning up the temple, and evidently had come in some disrepair, so they had to go make some repairs to the temple, and they collected money from the people to do that, and instead of doing that, they just put the money in their pockets. And so there was a confrontation. They said they agreed that they would neither collect any more money nor do anything to fix the temple. So that was their compromise. They just stopped stealing from people. But Josiah had them doing that. They took funds and started working on it. And while they're cleaning out the rooms, and there were a lot of weird things from the reading, and a lot of weird things in that temple. There was a section for, we don't know much about it. There was a section that was labeled something related to it said for the perverted persons. There was all kinds of things in there that had nothing to do with God, but had to do with other gods, and false worship that was allowed to be in there. So they're cleaning all these things out, getting rid of it all, and they stumble upon, of all things, what? Yeah, the law of Moses, and which would be, what would be in the scrolls? Which books? At least. And Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy would all have been considered part of the law. So the law specific is going to be more likely Leviticus, because it's dealing with the Levites and the laws, the things that they had to do. But when they found the law, they came and they read it to Josiah, and he tore his clothes immediately and proclaimed that this was going to be read to the people, and they read it in the hearing of the people, and there's lots of change that came about because of that. And it says that he turned his heart toward God like no one had done before in the past. And they even then had these great revival of following the law of the Lord, and had the first Passover they had in a while. And it said it was a Passover like hadn't been done since the time of the judges. So even David and Solomon didn't have a Passover like this one. And that doesn't go into great detail about why or how it was different or how it was better, except for the fact that it mentions the number of people that were invited to come, and so it could have been just a larger celebration. But it was done, and then it talks about his death in battle against Egypt. And this was a significant battle. God had told Josiah that he was still going to punish Judah for their sins, but not in his lifetime. And the significance of that, of course, is that his life ended, so now there's an open door for the punishment that's going to come, and it would come pretty soon after that. But this is the battle that I've mentioned before, the battle of Carchemish, that Pharaoh Necho was going from the south. He was going up from Egypt to Syria, and at a place called Carchemish, and the Assyrians were there. Pharaoh Necho was coming to give support and aid to the Syrians, and they were fighting against the Babylonians. Well, what have we seen with the Babylonians previously in the text? What did they do with Hezekiah? Right. These are the ones, they sent an envoy, and to check on him, right? But because he had been sick, because of the boil that he almost died from. Right, and so Nico, and I don't know if God had actually spoke him and told him that, but he did say, God said for you to not fight me, to go home. And so anyway, Pharaoh Necho was going up there to assist the Assyrians, and no one thought that the Babylonians had a shot at this in the world, but they pulled it off and defeated the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and that battle is a notorious battle in history. And when that happened, after it happened, they immediately recovered and marched south to Jerusalem and encircled it. I mean, it was one of the first things they did. And it's because of everything that Hezekiah showed them. They're like, we need money in our coffers, and there's plenty there, so let's go get it. And so it's interesting. This is exactly what God said was going to happen. But Josiah is trying to prevent Pharaoh from going through his land. It could be a simple territorial thing. I don't want an army going through my land. It could have been that he was wanting to help Babylon. It could be that he didn't want Assyria to be helped. It doesn't say why, but he did interfere, and he died in that process and was buried in the tomb of the kings, which marks a very big change, the end of a huge revival, because his son took over and it was downhill from there. He didn't do anything like his father had done. It says he followed the path of his fathers, plural, because Josiah didn't follow the path of his fathers, but his son did, and that was going evil, headlong into it. And so everything that Josiah had done, to any progress he made, was all taken back by his son. But anyway, then we go into Jeremiah chapters 1 through 13, and this again covers the calling of Jeremiah, his early prophecies against Judah and Jerusalem, and the general consensus or the general feel about Jeremiah started to become that he's just a negative. He's one who just enjoys talking about bad things happening to us, even calling him a traitor to the country because he's saying that other people are going to come in and attack. And so there's lots of things, and bad things began to happen to him, especially later on in the book. But that's the idea of what's going on. And in the book of Zephaniah, it's prophecies of judgment against Judah and other nations. And in prophesying against other countries in the area, he highlights the return of the people of Judah. So he's telling them, the other countries, don't get so excited about Judah and Jerusalem going into captivity. They're going to come back, and you're going to go into it. You'll be dispersed as well, and you will also suffer, and many of them wouldn't survive it. And so, as a people, so that's the idea of those books. Did anyone have anything we wanted to bring up from your reading that you thought was interesting or difficult that we can discuss? Sorry? You like this part of it? Yeah. It's a lot easier to read this kind of history than it is Leviticus or Numbers, right? Yeah, that's true. It's not really in order. It doesn't seem to be, so that's true. Jeremiah isn't. Okay, let's go to Jeremiah chapter 2. We're going to look at 4 through 13. And he uses interesting illustration here about them. But let's read verses 4 through 7. This is it's a message from God about his faithfulness and the unfaithfulness of the Israelites. And he is contrasting them and showing why why they're going to be punished, but also trying to reason with them. This shows a different part of God than a lot of people see. I don't know if you've heard, but you probably have. But there are people that in the religious world that believe that the God of the New Testament is a God of love and grace, and he'll reason with you, and the God of the Old Testament is vindictive and mean and angry, and he never cared about his people. He's always just looking to swat them. Well, that's just not true. If you read through the Old Testament, you see that very easily. It doesn't take very much time at all. But the reason that they can say those kinds of things is because most people don't read the Old Testament, right? They're convinced it's not that big of a deal. It's not important. I knew one man who said you could just take the New Testament and chunk the rest of it out the window because it's useless. There's all kinds of ideas that have been taught, and we're seeing a resurgence in the religious world of going back to the Old Testament. But unfortunately, people are so ignorant, meaning they haven't learned anything about the Old Testament. They're so ignorant of what the Old Testament says, they're falling for all kinds of things that the Old Testament never taught, but the people are teaching that it taught. And anyway, there's a lot that we can see in this book and other books, many other passages. All the passages can show you that God has heart. He's trying to reason with his people and trying to convince them that it just makes sense for them to give up and follow him instead of going back to what they were, going to false gods. All right, so verses 4 through 7 says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, what injustice have your fathers found in me, that they have gone far from me, have followed idols, and have become idolaters? Neither did they say, where is the Lord who who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, who led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and pits, through a land of drought and the shadow of death, through a land that no one crossed, and where no one dwelt. I brought you into a bountiful country to eat its fruit and its goodness. But when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination." Okay, so look at how he starts out with this. What injustice have your fathers found in me? So here we see the plea, the reasoning here that he gives them. And what the message, what have I done, right? Why is it that you have turned your back on me? What injustice have you seen in me that you would turn away from me? And that's a common idea that people have about God, is they see an injustice think is an injustice, and they turn their backs on him. And he's asking for that. What did your fathers see in me that they have gone far from me and have followed idols and become idolaters? And they wouldn't have heard probably much against God. Their children wouldn't have heard much against God that they would have brought up. It's possible some of them would, but you see the idea. He's trying to help them see that God doesn't want to punish them. He wants them to come back. And this sentiment is repeated over and over and over in the book and in all the Old Testament. In fact, it's even repeated all the way up into the New Testament. If you look over in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is he had just finished up a very harsh rebuke of the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, and the woes that he gave to them. Extremely harsh and well-deserved, but still harsh for them, difficult for them to hear, I'm sure. And if you look in verse 37, says that he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." What is the sentiment that's there in that passage? Yeah, and well, they definitely were. And here, this is not, in this passage, it's not really talking about idolatry, but has always been their history until the Babylonian captivity. But what is Jesus' attitude toward them here? You see anger? Yeah. He loves them. Right. He says, how long I've longed to gather your children. Yeah. So for a long time, he's been in the ministry for 3 years at this point, right? He's obviously not talking about his preaching. For a long time, he's wanted to gather them together like a hen gathers its chicks under its wings for protection, for help, but they weren't willing. And now everything, he says, your house is left to you desolate. It's over. And in fact, the next chapter, this is when he goes into the discussion of when the Romans are going to destroy the temple and Jerusalem, and millions of Jews will be killed. And this 7-year war that happened between Rome and Israel, and about the middle of that war is when the 70 AD happened, when the Roman army encircled the Jerusalem, and they were there for about a year. And the story behind that is incredible, because according to Josephus, no Christians were harmed in the attack, because they had seen the warnings from Jesus, and they saw the signs that he gave them, and they ran, which he told them to do. He said, go to the hills, go to the caves, and he said, remember he said, if you're on the rooftop, don't go in the house to get anything. If you're out in the field, don't go back to get anything. You just run, drop everything and run. When you see these things happening, it's over, and you need to hit the hills. And they did, and they were all saved. But about somewhere between 1 to 3 million Jews were killed at this time, and it was a matter of days at the most. It was fast. And because they encircled them, what they actually did was they encircled Jerusalem and built a wall around Jerusalem, so that they are between the outer wall. The Roman soldiers were between the outer wall and the wall of Jerusalem, and that's to keep anyone from getting out. So they could try to sneak out, but they built walls to keep them in. And so there were maybe a few people that could have escaped, but it was pretty brutal. And I've seen some documentaries and stuff on it. It's fascinating how it worked. They came in different waves, and they found a way to get in that was close to the temple, and ended up ransacking everything. It actually began because they had built these walls, and they're in the formations. They're just kind of waiting see what's going to happen, what the Jews are going to do, because they're starting to starve them out. And they had plenty of water, but they were going to run out of food. And there was some kind of altercation where one of the Jews threw something and hit one of the Roman soldiers or something, and it just avalanched from that. They just decided it's over. They just all marched in. And so it was one little thing, supposedly, that set it off. It was just a powder keg waiting to go off. And when they went in, they just killed everyone. They killed everyone they could find. And there was blood flowing in the streets. It was like, the descriptions was like streams of blood going down the streets like a river. They didn't intend at first to destroy the temple, evidently, but there was an accidental fire or something, and then they saw it was damaged, so they decided to go ahead and do it anyway. So they tore that thing apart, took everything out of it, and supposedly they took all the stones apart from it. And some of the reason they took the stones apart from it is because they decided that they're going to burn everything. And the fire was so hot that the gold began even to melt, and it went down even into the foundation stones. And so the people in plundering later, they went in, and it wasn't much later. They went in and were plundering. They took everything, and they took the stones because they even took the stones because there was gold that was in them, they thought. And so it was incredible what they did, and unheard of that it was the brutality that was there. And that's exactly what Jesus predicted was going to happen. But that's the idea that Jeremiah has in talking to them. Listen, it's over and over and over and over. God's telling them, you guys had better straighten up. And how many years did God warn them before 70 AD happened? Any idea? Hundreds and hundreds of years. And you could go all the way back to Solomon was in the 900s. When he died, it was downhill from there. There was the division right after his death. And so around 960 or 950 is when he died. And ever since then, they've been being warned by God. You better straighten up. You better straighten up. So 900 years or so of warnings, and he's pleading for them to make a change, and they won't do it. Then he goes back in Jeremiah chapter 2. He goes and brings them out of Egypt. He said he's reminding them of what he's done. He said in verse 6, they didn't say, "Where's the Lord who brought us up out of the land of Egypt?" They stopped looking for God, even though he's the one that brought them out of Egypt. And incidentally, what can you say is significant about God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt and starting a nation that way? Why is that such a big deal? Yeah, he was showing power and might. Yeah. No, it doesn't happen at all. Yeah, it shows his power, his wisdom, his might. In the greatest nation at the time on earth was the Egyptians, and he brought them out of that. So can you think of any other country that started the way Israel did? Of course there's not. If you look at the factor, especially of the plagues and all the things that happened during that, they walked away. Not only did they walk away, having not fought anyone, there was no fighting at all. What did they have when they left? They plundered the Egyptians. Yeah, the Egyptians, it's not like they stole anything. The Egyptians came to them and said, "Here, take this, leave," right? They just gave them everything and said, "Get out of here." Because of the plagues and the difficult, God did all of that, right? So that's an amazing idea in itself. But even if you take out the plagues, what people can say that their country started or their nation started because they left peacefully with the blessing of another country and just left and started their own, right? It doesn't happen. It's not typically what happens, and so it shows a lot of things that God did. And then not only that, he says he led you through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and pits, through a land of droughts and the shadow of death, through a land that no one crossed and where no one dwelt. So that was, of course, the wilderness wandering. Incidentally, do you know how long it should have taken to walk from Egypt to Israel? Yes, very short time. You could easily do it in 30 days. It probably wouldn't even be anywhere near that. I've never really thought about how long it is, but it's a long trip, but it's not that long. And I forgot how long it is to Jerusalem, how far it is to Jerusalem, but it could have been done in a month, even with all those people. How long did it take them? For 40 years. And incidentally, according to Numbers, why is it that God caused them to walk in the wilderness for that long? It was a disobedience, right? What lesson was he teaching? Jesus even used this one in his temptation, one of his temptations, so that you can learn I lost it. that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That's what Jesus quoted when he was offered the temptation of the bread. But he's actually quoting Deuteronomy, where Moses said, hey, you're wandering in this wilderness, so you learn this lesson. You better learn this lesson. You don't want to go through this again. So you learn, what was the lesson they learned? The bread that they needed was not physical bread, it's God, above everything else. That's the lesson, and it's a great lesson. Hard learned. I don't know if they actually figured it out at that point, but I think they did for at least a generation, right? All right, so verse 7, it says he brought them into a bountiful country to eat its fruit and its goodness. But when you entered, you defiled my land, made my heritage an abomination. All right, this is a reference to this central area that Israel was given. It wasn't just a plot of land. It was very strategic in where it was, but it was also incredibly fruitful. They call it what do they call that? I think not the Golden Crescent. Maybe it's the Green Crescent. There is a small patch of land from Egypt to Babylon that is formed like a crescent, and that's what they got. And so it put them ideally in a great spot. The Egyptians and the people in the Syrian region had always fought over this land. So they were in the middle of it, but they were given that and given great relief from enemies on all sides by David and by Solomon and the wealth that was produced there that God established for them. But this is it still is the Fertile Crescent. That's what they call it. And it's one of the in that region, it's one of the most fertile areas that there is. So when he gave them a land of milk and honey, it was a land that was overflowing with abundance. And this is what he's pointing out. It's the best land that they could have gotten, especially in that area, because outside of that is just wilderness and desert. Although there's some indication that the deserts weren't nearly as bad as the passages in the Bible also often call them deserts or sometimes wilderness. And there's some indication that it wasn't just sand. There was actually trees and things like that in a lot of that land. And I don't know about the Sahara. I don't know the history of that. But, the Sahara, well, that's not where the Sahara is it? The Sahara is in northern Africa. Anyway, that region wasn't always desert. And it actually was probably probably just poor habits of agriculture that caused problems that come from there. Could have been other factors, but anyway, God gave them the best of the land, and he's reminding them that. And this is a place where they crossed. They didn't go through, it says a land of deserts and pits, through a land of drought and the shadow of death, so that we definitely have those kinds of conditions that were there. And then he brings them charges in verses 7 through 11. Look at what he says there. I brought you into the country, a bountiful country, to eat its fruit and its goodness, but when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. The priests did not say, where is the Lord? And those who handle the law did not know me. The rulers also transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and walked after things that do not profit. Therefore, I will yet bring charges against you, says the Lord, and against your children's children I will bring charges. For pass beyond the coast of Cyprus and see, send to Kedar and consider diligently and see if there has been such a thing. Has a nation changed its gods, which are not gods, but my people have changed their glory for what does not profit? All right, so the accusation is what? The charge against them is what? Yeah. And so he's asking the question. He says, go all over and ask anyone else. What's the question they're supposed to be asking? Has anyone ever given up their own gods to follow another set of gods? I don't know the answer to that. I would assume probably not, right? There have been times where people in the region there might have adopted practices because of Israel, but it may have been enforced on them. But typically speaking, people don't give up their gods. That's why they were having battles and fights and all kinds to prove whose God is better. That's part of it anyway. So now we have this land that was defiled by them. They forgot about him. The priests forgot to seek for him. The lawyers failed to know him. The ones who were dealing with God's law didn't know who God was. That's significant. And the prophets prophesied by false gods. And not only, he says, no other people give up their own gods to chase other gods. But he said, but you have done even worse, because you have changed your glory, which is a reference to God and also to Jerusalem. You've changed your glory for what doesn't profit at all. You've changed the one who actually has been helpful for you and brought you all these different things and blessings, and you've chased things that you know are worthless and useless and have been proven to be so. So even if nations did give up their gods to go after other gods, this is even worse, because they may not have known any better. They're just changing one for the other, but you do know better. You've seen how I've been interacting with you. This is kind of the idea. All right, any thoughts? Yeah, that's right. Romans chapter 1 teaches that. They gave up the truth for a lie. And it's one thing to give up one lie for another, but when you have the truth, and you know you have the truth, and you still give it up, this is why one of the reasons he's addressing them. In fact, he goes in verses 12 and 13. He says, "Be astonished, O heavens, at this. Be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, says the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water." So, two different things that they've done, and they both go hand in hand. The consequence, one is the consequence of the other. What does he say is the first evil that they did? They forsook him, and he calls himself what? The fountain of living water. Yeah. What does that term living water mean? What does it mean to say living water? It probably means something in our vernacular than it did back then. We might think that there's water that has life in it, right? That's not what it means. It's a Hebrew term. It's a Hebrewism. It's a figure of speech, and it just refers to a bubbling up of water. It never goes away. It's living, and so it doesn't. You go and you take the water and go back the next day, and there's more water because it keeps supplying it. So what did they do? They gave up this bubbling brook of water that they need, and of course, in this area. They would have to have these different sources of water for crops and everything else. All right, so that was the first thing that they did, and then it says that they not only gave up the bubbling brook that had plenty of water for them, they decided to go and create cisterns. And what is a cistern? It's a place. It's underground where they get runoff for runoff of rain and things like this, so that they would have water in there, and they would make it out of, I don't really know what they make it out of. I think pottery would be involved. I was going to say pottery, but I'm not exactly positive now that I'm thinking about it. But they would create it so that it would hold the water, and the runoff would go in, and they would use it for all kinds of things, right? So it may not have rained very often, but it would rain in seasons. In the season of rain, they would collect all the water they could. And it wasn't illegal to collect rainwater back then, and and that's a very common thing. But their cistern was one that was broken; it wouldn't hold any water. So they're putting the water in, and they go one day and take water out, and come back the next day, and there's actually less water in it instead of more. What does that represent? The futility, yeah. And it's the chasing after other gods. It can't supply anything for you. They can't supply your needs. They can't help you. There's nothing there. And, we're having people today, actually, that are beginning to say this more and more. I haven't heard a whole lot, but I have heard it, that there are other gods, but that Jehovah God is the greatest of them. And that's what a lot of them thought back then. And God keeps saying, when he says, for example, when we have a song that we sing that says that we place you above all gods. And someone came to me one time, we sang that song, and it wasn't here, and they said, do you actually believe that there are other gods? I was like, no, there are no other gods. Well, the song says that there is. It's a figure of speech. It just means that there's nothing else out there. God's the only one. But some people are taking that figure of speech and saying, see, there are other gods, but God is the greater of all the gods. And so it says he's the God of all the gods. Well, he wouldn't say that he's God of all gods if there weren't other gods, which is completely false. That's not the idea at all. There were gods back then, but these gods they're not real. The only reality of the gods was the fact that someone took a tree and decorated it and bowed down and worshipped it. That's the only reason it was a god. And it wasn't because there's an entity. Some people were actually teaching today, and they did back then as well, that demons or false gods, fallen angels would come and present themselves as gods, and they would build things to them. There's no indication from the scriptures that that's happened, but that's a very popular idea. And so they come and say, well, he's the superior one. There are no other gods. Now, there are angelic beings, there's no question about that. There are demonic spirits, there's no question about that, but these would never be considered gods, and God never considered them that. And so anyway, yeah. Go ahead, Holly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, right. And of course the point is not to say that you shouldn't build cisterns, but they were abandoning what they had that was good and doing, like you said, it was based on their own efforts. That's one way of looking at it for sure. So, yeah, that's true. Their way was better. What were you going to say? Similar? Yeah. Right. Yeah, when you put those things first, they become a god to us. Yeah, and you're subjecting yourself to them. Yeah, that's right. So we do create our own gods if we're not careful, but they're not the same entity that. Exactly. The only power they have is what we give them, right? So really, that's what it comes down to. And they're fooling themselves into thinking they can take care of themselves. That's a lot of what this is. So they created their own cisterns, their own ways of survival, but those cisterns were broken and couldn't hold water. So how can we see similar thinking patterns in our time? Have you seen any thinking patterns like this? The what? Yeah, so I can do it myself. We have I think this is human nature, but in our country we have this as idealized, that I can take care of myself. I don't need anyone else, right? And how much of our success can be credited to God's blessing that has nothing to do with my ability. A lot. And for some people, a lot more than they feel like they should admit. But this is something we see. So anyway, we had some good discussion about that. Thank you very much.